Hello everyone, I'm Brazen Eagle and thank you for joining me here. So, from Yahoo Finance, we have Japan begins experiment of opening to immigration by Noah Smith on May 22nd. Now obviously we have a chart here seeing the number of foreign workers in Japan, which has doubled since 2013, only 6 years ago. As you can tell, there's been a slight increase in workers from China, but also more and more workers from other nations, as well as Vietnam. While in Tokyo earlier this month, I couldn't help but notice the city has changed, where it once was rare to hear any language other than Japanese spoken on the street. Now it happens constantly. Most of this is due to the high tourism boom. More than 30 million people now visit Japan every year. That's pretty good, you know? Tourism's a good business sometimes to get into. But obscured by that vast influx of guests is a longer-term trend. Tokyo is becoming a much more ethnically diverse city. I encountered black store clerks from the Netherlands and Africa, Chinese waiters at traditional Japanese restaurants, South Asian students staffing convenience stores, a white waitress at Starbucks, a Korean restaurant run by Southeast Asians. These are anecdotes, but there's data to back them up. In 2018, 1 out of 8 young people turning 20 in Tokyo was not born in Japan. That doesn't even count the people who were born in Japan but aren't ethnically Japanese. Although Tokyo isn't close to becoming a multiracial metropolis like, New York City or London, the word homogeneous no longer fits the city. Tokyo is an early harbinger of changes that are coming, albeit more slowly, to the rest of Japan. The capital city diversity is in large part the result of Japan's increasingly open stance towards immigration. Japan's foreign-born population is still small compared to most other rich countries, a legacy of the highly restrictive attitudes and policies towards immigration that prevailed in past years. But since Shinzo Abe became prime minister at the end of 2012, the number of foreign-born people working in the country has expanded steadily. The government reckons there are now about 2.73 million foreigners living in the country, a 6.6, of course, increase over the previous year, even as the overall population shrinks. Sounds kind of like the other Western countries. In recent years, the Abe administration has adopted major changes that will probably sustain the influx of immigrants. In 2017, Japan implemented fast-track permanent residency for skilled workers. Excuse me. In 2018, it passed a law that will greatly expand the number of blue-collar visas, work visas, and crucially, provide these workers with a path to permanent residency if they want it. These changes thus represent true immigration as opposed to temporary guest worker policies, despite the common use of the term guest worker law to describe the new visas. In time, of course, it will mean a more ethnically diverse Japanese citizenry. Permanent residents are allowed to apply for Japanese citizenship after 5 years. Some foreigners will also marry Japanese nationals, and their children will thus be citizens as well. Since the new law prevents visa holders from bringing families with them to Japan, many of the new workers will likely be single people looking for spouses, making them more likely to marry locals. While this new immigration will help keep Japan's economy and pension system afloat, it will inevitably introduce social strains. Unlike the US, Canada, and other nations whose populations are mainly a hodgepodge of the descendants of recent immigrants, Japan has little history of mass immigration. The one major recent episode of immigration was the movement of Koreans to Japan during the Japanese colonization of Korea and later during the Korean War. Due to Japan's lack of birthright citizenship, the descendants of those immigrants have become a racialized minority speaking no Korean but bearing Korean passports. Discrimination against these people, sometimes called Zainichi Koreans, was severe for decades, and though it has decreased substantially in recent years, a far-right fringe has emerged to persecute and slander the Zainichi. Abe, despite being a conservative on foreign policy issues, has not tolerated these groups. In 2016, Japan passed its first law against hate speech, which is now being used to prosecute members of this group. But the episode shows that Japanese society probably won't be immune to the waves of nativist populism that has rocked Western countries in recent years. This article is bent towards a certain slant. Anyways, if even ethnic Koreans, who are generally physically indistinguishable from ethnic Japanese people, face persecution, people of visibly different racial groups may encounter even more. An early sign of such tensions emerged in 2015 when a beauty pageant winner who was ethnically half Japanese and half black became the center of an online controversy, with some criticizing her for not being Japanese enough and others leaping to her defense. For now, the racial purists have been generally shouted down, and a half-Indian woman won Miss World Japan pageant in 2016 with little backlash. But as the number of mixed and minority people in Japan becomes more prominent, the rightists can be expected to return with fresh rage. Obviously, this is quite a bias this guy has. Anyways, more generally, Japan's institutions are not used in coping with foreign and minority residents. Unlike in the US, where English as a second language classes are being widely made available, Japan has few classes to assist non-native speakers to catch up in Japanese fluency. Nor do Japanese cities have many official celebrations of immigrant culture or contributions. Well, obviously. So Japan is beginning a major and unprecedented exercise, similar in some ways to the experiments embarked on by many European countries. Japan is still far from being a diverse country, but it's no longer quite right to call it homogeneous, or some would call it an ethno-state. The next 2 to 3 decades will reveal whether the country's culture and institutions will be able to learn from Europe's experience and manage a smooth transition, or whether immigration will spark a nativist backlash that closes the country off once again and this was all by Noah Smith. So here is kind of my response. But before I go into my thoughts on this article, like I said earlier, this is basically, even though it says Yahoo Finance, it's really from Bloomberg Opinion. So now that being said, you need to ask yourself this. Why does Japan need immigrants? Well, obviously, its population is declining, and it'll be less Japanese people in the future than today. Now, many people would call Japan, like I said, an ethno-state with very little minority communities. Basically, what it boils down to is this. You need more population because you need people to pay for your welfare state. From this article, it even goes into saying that the new immigration, and continue to open Japan's borders to even more immigrants, is to help keep Japan's economy and pension system afloat. That is the main reason why Japan is opening up its borders to immigrants. It comes down to money. Japan needs workers for its welfare state, and the Japanese women are obviously not having babies. You can't blame the men for not having babies because, well, babies don't come from men. Well, at least fully developed babies. Anyways, this article early on states that Tokyo, the capital of Japan, is quickly becoming ethnically diverse. Very similar to many, other Western countries, cities such as Boston, United States, Berlin, Germany is definitely ethnic, from what I hear, and probably Paris, France, Nice, France, other Western countries and cities. But before I go further on, I'm not saying that immigration is inherently bad. Immigration, much like everything else, has its pros and its cons. Sometimes what might seem like a good idea in the short term may end up a terrible consequence in the future. For example, we have recent history to tell us pros and cons of immigration. Right now, I have this article from Wikipedia called Gastarbeiter. For example, between the 1950s to the 60s to the early 70s, Germany imported many immigrants because of labor shortages. In the short term, that was a good thing to do. Germany had to have more workers because, after World War II, it might not have had a ton of workers, However, but right now, we are in the long term. Or at least Germany itself is in the long-term stretch because of what it did in the past. Germany, according to this other Wikipedia page, has around 4 million Turks, or people who claim Turkish descent. It's around 4 million. Some would say it maybe 5 million, 4 million. It's down here in Wikipedia. It says around 4 million. And another official has stated that there are up to 7 million Turks, including the second generation that immigrated or were descendants of the original immigrants to Germany. But basically, because of the long-term consequences of opening up your borders to people who do not want to become, part of your country or culture, Germany is now feeling the effects, which could happen to Japan in the future. For example, if you study German history post-World War II, you'll understand that these Turks, almost all the Turks, they don't want or care to become culturally, socially German. They want to be Turks. They want to be Muslims. They want to be Turks. They don't want to be German. And that's the effect that we are, well, maybe not we, but maybe Germany is feeling today. And you know what? The cultural differences between your regular native German and your German-born but actually of Turkish descent person, the cultural divide is getting wider and more radicalized day by day because of the mistakes of basically our forefathers, or at least in this case, the German forefathers. So Japan really needs to think about that before they open up mass migration to the world to come to Japan to pay for their welfare state. It sounds like, to me at least, that the future generations will have to suffer the consequences of the current people. Kind of sounds like other programs in other Western countries. But you know what? This video is about Japan. What I'm saying, though, is this. If you want your country and culture to continue, culture is important. If you want it to continue, you must assimilate everyone immigrating to your country if you allow immigration. Because if you don't, eventually you'll have a lot of people who believe different things, who have different cultural values, and you know what? History has proven that when one side becomes too strong and, differences, they might go head to head and duke it out. And if you want to avoid war, well, don't do what Japan or Germany has done, But this means that Japan, as we know it, may not culturally exist within 100 years. Yes, 100 years from now. That's a long time away, but it'll come here before we know it. The country of Japan might literally be around, much like Germany or France, but the people and the culture might have been replaced by then. Who knows? Maybe Japan will be filled with nothing but Africans. I doubt it. But if Japan wants to do that, or become basically little China, it can choose to do so. For Japan, though, it can solve its own problem without opening up its borders. Actually having extremely closed borders, like what Japan has traditionally done, is a cultural mark of Japan. If Japan, though, wants its native birth rate to rise to an acceptable level, you must do several things. 4 things that I've listed out. First, you must give up the idea of having most women in the workforce. Women cannot have babies and work at the same time. You just can't be in 2 places at once. Step 2, encourage the traditional family unit. Make sure, you have both men and women working in different ways to, create a good family. With women working at home, with the men working away. Third, now give men an incentive to work for a family. Right now, there are many men in Japan called herbivore men who are not in education, employment, or training. They don't have an incentive to work for a family. Why should they? If anything, they should just look out for themselves. You have to incentivize people to get things done. And maybe to do a good job doing those things. You got to give men a good incentive to raise a family. And fourth of all, and this might be the most important, but it might not be, is don't abuse men to be literal wage slaves. You hear about these stories from Japan where men, they literally work themselves to death just trying to make money, and then they die. Why would men want to work for that? Why would men want to work to die? That makes no sense. The men in Japan are saying, I don't want that life. I don't want to work until I die in my job in my 40s. That just doesn't make sense for men to, want to commit suicide that way. But, only after those 4 things are achieved will Japan have a better native birth rate instead of embracing eventual multiculturalism that is strangling Western countries. But you know what? Japan will continue to do its thing despite its traditions and a history of failed actions that have helped doom Western civilization, including opening up your borders to complete mass immigration without assimilation. But with that in mind, thank you very much. I'm Brazen Eagle, and I hope you have a great day.